So how the do you make a podcast in 2022? How do you get the best gear? How do you upload the podcast? How do you maintain the podcast? And ultimately, how do you get that podcast going? Yeah, Eric and I started a podcast here in the studio, and we've loved every minute of it. In fact, we have 3 microphones, and today I'm showing you how we set up our microphones, what gear we've used, and what gear you could potentially set up if you're looking to get that ultimate podcast going for this coming year. Let's roll. What is up, everybody? My name is Steven, and today we are talking about podcasting. Since there's a boardroom session going on above me where they're talking about financials at a very loud level, I thought, let's utilize the podcast mic when I vlog. And from there, I thought, well, let's just do an episode on how we set up the podcast here in the studio. Eric and I, for a shameless plug, jumped into the world of podcasting recently on our new podcast, The Studio 29. And from there, we've learned how to create our ultimate 2022 podcast setup. This includes 3 microphones as well as a Zoom H6 recorder, and it's given us the ability of being able to capture amazing audio as well as share those stories in a high quality format. What do you do when you want to create a podcast? Now, there's many different ways of setting up a podcast, and you don't have to go too high tech. However, if you want to create an effective podcast that has very high quality audio, it's a good idea to invest into a good microphone system, a good recording system, editing system, and ultimately a posting system. So I'm going to break down the various steps about how I set up whatever this arm you can see here next to me with this microphone attached, how I take the audio into a recorder, and then put it into the computer for editing and then ultimately posting. So the first thing with podcasting is you have to have a good gear setup. Now, you don't need to break the bank, obviously, but if you want to have good quality audio, nothing really beats having a dedicated podcast microphone and system setup and recorder when it comes to taking audio in. Now, with this setup that I'm going to talk about, it also has the option of being able to plug in multiple microphones, because as we progress in the podcasting world, it's great to bring guests into your podcasting channel. Now, you can of course do it, remotely online through Zoom or definite video conferencing. But if you want to have someone come into your studio, if you're thinking of getting that far in advance with making your channel, why not get a recorder and a system setup that allows for multiple microphones? So let's talk about how we set this up. So for $90, we have the Samsung MBA 38-38-inch microphone boom arm for podcasting and streaming. This is awesome as it allows us also to be able to clamp it down to a desk because it comes with a desk clamp. It also has 2 ties to be able to manage your cables. So next up is a bit of a luxury. However, I definitely recommend getting one. It's the Zoom H6 multi-track recorder. You can have 4 different XLR connections that you can plug into it. It also records directly to an SD card, and this also has a built-in microphone, omnidirectional, on top. Now, price point's a little bit pricey at about 400 Canadian to 450 if you can find one on sale, but if you get one, you'll never regret it, as it's definitely an asset to any sound recording kit. Moving right along, we have the U-Green XLR cable, male to female, which is balanced with a 3-pin. This is a 10-foot cable, and usually it retails for about $16. This allows you to run a direct connection right from the microphone all the way to your recorder, and this gives you a high-quality line of recording transmission. And finally, we have the Rode PodMic Cardioid Dynamic Microphone. Say that 10 times fast. Now, we have 3 of these, and we love these microphones. They're versatile, high quality, that give great results in editing. And this one usually runs for about $130. It's well built, all metal, and Rode makes fantastic microphones. As everyone knows, they're an industry leader when it comes to microphones in any kind of format. So as you can tell, it's not the cheapest setup for setting up your podcast system, but for roughly about $700, you've got yourself a fantastic and durable, as well as high quality audio system, which is professional. It's not just run-of-the-gun at-home recording. You can utilize this in any situation, any professional situation, and the results are definitely ones to stand by. Now, I love using this setup because we have 3 of them. It gives the same level quality of audio for each speaker, because I find a podcast, it's important to have the same style of microphone. Maybe I'm just being picky, but I don't like to hear different quality audio when I'm listening to my podcast. I like the microphones to be all consistent, kind of like cameras and shooting profiles. So in this case, we have 3 of them that both Eric and I use, so we know the audio is going to be the same and we can balance it right directly to our recorder. So once you've shot your podcast, how do you edit it to get it out the door? I'm going to show you how I set up my podcast editing in Premiere Pro. Now, another disclaimer, of course, this is a paid software, so it's not free. And there's lots of software out there that is free. But for me, since I edit video, why not utilize the same software that I use for my workflow? Let's hop into Premiere and I'll show you how I set up a basic intro and outro in my podcast setup. So welcome to Premiere Pro, and this is basically my editing suite for all things video, but why not use it for also audio? And this is my best setup, my quickest setup, because I know the process, I know the program well, and I can just drop my audio in and I can export it quickly, thus making my podcast. So number one, I always like to make sure that you have a good sound intro, and I highly recommend taking a look at the good folks at Epidemic Sound. Another non-shameless plug, because we're not sponsored by Epidemic Sound, although I would love to be one day, but you can find all sorts of music to basically be your intro music for the podcast. Disclaimer, most podcasts don't have music in the background, but if you'd like to have that intro music and outro music to your podcast, why not grab some beautiful open source music? So I've got Alienated here by ELFL. So I downloaded that, I have it in my project folder here for podcasting. And essentially, I've already dragged on my audio, which we can hear right now. So welcome to your podcast. This is the podcast channel where we talk about all things you and what you want to talk about and your story or the stories you're going to share. So that's my podcast, essentially all 11 seconds of glory here. And I'm going to put in a audio track to begin to kind of give it this, new branded style intro. So we have the audio here from Alienated, and let's just bring this on to our timeline. We're going to expand down here, take a look at the wave format. And when we zoom in here using the sliders, we can kind of tell where this kind of begins. Always in Premiere Pro, drop down your amplitude here because it usually overshoots the amplification level a little bit. So let's have a listen to it and see how loud it is, and we can adjust essentially with this naturally. So welcome to your podcast. This is the podcast channel where we talk about all things you and what you want to talk about. So as you can tell, we kind of adjusted the audio just to make sure it works with the voice. Let's hear it one more time. So welcome to your podcast. This is the podcast channel where we talk about all things you and what you want to talk about and your story or the stories you're going to share. So there you go. Essentially, it's 11 seconds of an intro. And what I'm going to do here is I'm basically going to dovetail the audio in and dovetail the audio out. To do that, it's very simple in Premiere Pro. There's a little stop add keyframe down here on the bottom left of the track. And what we can do is we can kind of raise the volume at the beginning of our clip, and then we can kind of lower that keyframe down to essentially introduce the actual spoken audio of our recording. So let's add a keyframe here at the beginning. We're going to add a keyframe here in the middle, and add a keyframe about right here too. So we're going to raise this up. And we're going to kind of have that, swell to begin the video, or swell to begin, this podcast. And then we're going to gradually fade it away. So we just kind of scoot along here, and we're going to kind of go down about right there. So give ourselves a kind of a gradual wave in and out. Make sure it's not too loud so we can still hear the entrance to the audio. Let's take a listen to that. So welcome to your podcast. This is the podcast channel where we talk about all things you. That's probably a little too abrupt. Let's just lengthen out this last keyframe a bit so we can kind of make this a little bit longer. One more time. So welcome to your podcast. This is the podcast channel where we talk about all things you and what you want to talk about and your story or the stories you're going to share. Okay, so that basically is essentially the podcast. Now I'm going to go to the end here, hit O, which is essentially in and out for any timeline work here in Premiere Pro. So I now have my full podcast ready. Now, one thing you can also do is if you ever want to be able to check out your sound, if you want to manipulate the sound and raise different levels, change any kind of effects, if you want to make the voice more present, you can go here to the effects control panel and you can look up various plugins like multi-band compressor. You can add that on by just dragging it onto your sound. You can also look at parametric equalizer. Now this is always to do with sound levels to make that sound recording better. However, if you're using this particular setup that I was talking about, the sound quality is pretty good off the bat, so you don't have to do too much sound editing in post, unless of course it's a very noisy environment or you need to remove an echo or remove some noise in the background. I made a video which I'm going to post at the top of the right here in the video here that you can take a look at about how to get the best quality audio and how to reduce noise and make sure you make that volume more present. So definitely check out top here when I add this card in post. Okay, so everything is now done. We've made our 30-minute podcast, and not obviously 11 seconds, but we have an intro. Just repeat this for the outro. You want to do the same thing, use the same music, and essentially just do keyframes to kind of swell it in towards the end of your audio, as well as swell out. So it kind of gives an intro and an outro to your podcast. Now you're going to go over here to File, you're going to go down to Export, and you're going to go over to Media. Media is going to bring up essentially what you see for all things exporting video, but in this case, there's no video. We're just exporting audio. So go over here to your format, and you're going to go down to MP3, which is right there. So we have our MP3 here brought up. So as you can tell, there's no preview, it's just audio. I like to go from the format to the preset of making sure you use the highest quality audio. The files aren't that big, it's not video files, these are audio files. So go down to MP3 256 kbps high quality. So it's the highest quality audio stereo channel sound. From there, we can name our file, and we're going to go for high stereo channel audio bit rate of 256 kbps, and we can make sure our codec quality is also high. And once we're ready, we're just going to hit export. Make sure you output your name correctly so you know where it's going to be, but let's just output this now to the podcast episode as example. I still can't spell today. Example podcast. There you go. MP3, that's our first episode. We're going to hit export. Boom, it's done. And that essentially is your podcast exported in Premiere Pro. Now, to go over to Buzzsprout, we're going to go over here and look up buzzsprout.com. Now, this is our Studio 29 podcast, but obviously sign into Buzzsprout and set yourself up with your own unique account. You can make some channel art. As you can tell, there is the various episodes that we have up and the various downloads, and also a status monitor for how many hours and uploading time we have left of this cycle. It also gives us, as I said before, stats from the last 7 days, the 30th days, all time. All this area and information is all calculated, and it gives you more information for where your podcast is. You can also see where it's been listened to on Spotify, on Apple apps, on Apple Podcasts, etc. How many downloads, you have 8 downloads here, for example, and the different various providers that we use. We use Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Stitcher for most of our podcasts, as well as Chromecast. Now, this is basic, free information that we have from the free version of Buzzsprout that we use. We also have locations where we can see where it's gone to, such as North America, Europe, and Asia. This is all relevant information that you can utilize to be able to find the stats and find the information about your podcast and how well it does, including also apps and devices that view your podcast, If it's going to be on Spotify, your iPhone, the mobile device, all this is data which is invaluable to know what audience interacts or listens to your podcast and where you can make sure to target when you're making podcasts in the future. Essentially, your podcast, let's just see where it is. It's over here in my drive, my podcast episode. My podcast audio is right here. And if we listen to it, which takes forever to load on my... So if we go over here to where the podcast is, it's right here. I'm gonna look at my file, quick look. And if I play, there is our podcast.
Welcome to your podcast. This is the podcast channel where we talk about all things you and what you want to talk about and your story.
Now that is our podcast, which we would then upload to our podcast channel. So if we go over here to episodes, upload a new podcast, choose a new file to upload, we then find the file to add, essentially add our title, add our description, and there you go. Our podcast is uploaded to the magical service of Buzzsprout.
So that, my friends, is how we set up our 2022 Ultimate Podcasting System. Now, this result works really well for us, and there's a whole host of different ways that you can set up your own podcasting system. But make sure that you have a regular game plan and setup. It just saves so much time and makes the workflow easier. There's nothing better than walking up to a prearranged system that you just hit record, you pop it into your computer, and then you edit, export, share. And speaking of sharing, make sure that you also share your podcast links on Twitter, on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram even.
have that podcast shared to the world, have some good graphic art, and make sure that you regularly share your podcasting so people know that there's a new episode coming up. Because podcasts are not really like YouTube videos. People don't really go back into past podcasts. They wait for the next one to come up. It's kind of a digestible content system. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like and subscribe button below and drop me a line on how you set up your podcast system. Do you think this would work for you? Is it overkill? And ultimately, how do you set up your podcast and what's your podcast name? Because I'd love to know. Until next time, I will catch you later.